Thomas of Windlow stood in the doorway of his small wooden hut as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The cold seeped through the worn soles of his boots, biting into his skin like a warning. This was not just another morning. He could feel it in the stillness of the air, in the way the earth seemed to hold its breath beneath the weight of an unspoken dread. The rain had not stopped for weeks, turning the fields into a sea of mud and rot. Seedlings that should have been pushing their way toward the sun were instead swallowed by the damp, lifeless soil. And yet, there would be no mercy from the manor. Thomas tightened his woolen cloak around his shoulders, though it did little to ward off the chill in the air or the heaviness in his chest. His children's stomachs would not be full this winter. That much was certain now. The Lord's men would come soon enough, demanding their share of grain, a share that did not belong to them, but which Thomas had no power to refuse. He stepped outside into the mist, the smell of wet earth and smoke clinging to the air like a ghost. His eldest son, John, followed silently behind him, eyes sunken from hunger. At only 12 years old, the boy already bore the burden of survival. There was no childhood here, only labor and loss. Their pigs were thin, their chickens barely laying. Even the goats had grown sluggish, their milk production dwindling with each passing day. And yet, the tribute had doubled. No explanation had been given. No appeal was allowed. Inside the hut, Alice cradled young Mary, whose breath came in shallow wheezes. She had been sick for days, her fever rising and falling like the tide. No healer had come. No herbs helped. Only prayer remained, and even that felt like a whisper lost in the wind. A knock echoed against the door. Brother Robert, the monk from the nearby abbey, entered with a heavy expression. "The famine is coming," he whispered. "You must prepare." Prepare? With what? Thomas looked at his family, then at the muddy fields beyond. This was not just another hard year. This was the beginning of something far worse. He had seen signs before, the birds flying south too early, the cattle restless in the night, the silence that fell over the forest just before the storm. But nothing had prepared him for this. The harvest had failed before, yes, but never like this. Never when the Lord demanded more than ever. Never when the rains refused to stop. Never when the land itself seemed to turn against those who worked it. Brother Robert placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "There are rumors in the village," he said quietly. "Some say the Lord plans to raise the rent again next year if the harvest does not improve." Thomas clenched his jaw. There would be no improvement. Not this year. Not with the fields drowned and the seed wasted. He thought of the other families in Windlow, struggling just as he was. Some had already begun trading their tools for food. Others had sold their livestock, knowing they could not feed them through the winter. And still others had vanished overnight, leaving behind empty cottages and unanswered questions. The monk lowered his voice. "If you can, store what little grain you have left. Do not let the Lord's men see it. If word spreads that any of you have reserves, they will take them." Thomas nodded slowly, though he knew there was little to hide. A few sacks of barley, a handful of dried vegetables, barely enough to last a week, let alone a season. But he would protect it all the same. For his wife. For his children. As Brother Robert left, Thomas watched him disappear into the fog, his robe flapping in the wind like a shadow retreating into darkness. Then he turned back to the fields. The work had already begun. There was no time to waste. John waited beside him, silent but ready. Together, they walked toward the barn, where the oxen stood shivering in the cold. The plow was worn, its wooden frame cracked from years of use. It was all they had, all they needed. Thomas ran a calloused hand along the handle, feeling the grooves carved by years of labor. He remembered his father using this same plow, remembered watching him bend under the weight of the world, just as Thomas did now. There was no escape from the land. It gave nothing freely and took everything in return. But still he worked. By mid-morning, the rest of the family had joined him. Alice moved with quiet determination, pulling weeds from the garden despite the tremble in her fingers. Mary sat nearby, wrapped in a tattered blanket, watching with wide, tired eyes. She tried to smile, but the effort seemed too great. Thomas saw it, the slow fading of strength, the way her body curled inward as if trying to preserve warmth. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that they would find food, that she would survive. But the words stuck in his throat, heavy with doubt. Instead, he worked harder. He pushed the plow deeper into the soil, forcing it forward with every ounce of strength he had left. The oxen groaned under the strain, their breath visible in the cold air. Mud clung to the wheels, slowing them down, mocking their efforts. And still he worked, because stopping meant surrender, meant giving up. And Thomas of Windlow had not survived 35 winters in this cruel world just to watch his family starve. The sun rose higher, but no warmth came with it. The clouds hung low, threatening more rain. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like a warning. Famine was coming, and Thomas would do whatever it took to keep his family alive. The days stretched into weeks, and still, the rain did not stop. It fell in relentless sheets, turning the fields of Windlow into a graveyard for crops that never had the chance to grow. Thomas could feel the weight of each drop like a hammer against his resolve. Every morning, he stepped outside expecting the storm to have passed, but the sky remained an endless gray, heavy with unspent fury. Inside the cottage, Alice moved like a shadow, her hands raw from scrubbing what little clothing they had left. John worked harder than ever, gathering firewood, even when it was too wet to burn. And Mary, sweet, fragile Mary, grew weaker by the day. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her lips pale as if the very warmth of life was being stolen from her. Thomas tried not to let despair take root, but it crept in through the cracks in the walls, through the silence between words, through the empty sacks where grain should have been stored. He knew hunger would come soon enough, not just for him, but for every family in Windlow. There were whispers in the village, rumors of other towns where people had already begun to starve. Some said a child had died near the river, too weak to fight off fever. Others claimed a farmer had gone mad and tried to eat the bark from the trees. No one knew what was true anymore, only that this was not a normal year. One evening, as Thomas sat beside the hearth, staring into the dying embers, Brother Robert returned. His robes were soaked, his face drawn with exhaustion. "It's worse than I feared," he said quietly. "The roads are flooded. The abbey cannot send aid." Thomas clenched his jaw. Aid. As if charity could save them now. Brother Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "I brought you something." From beneath his cloak, he pulled a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were a few dried apples and a handful of hard biscuits. "Not much," he admitted, "but it will buy you time." Thomas nodded, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. Nothing would be enough. That night, he lay awake long after Alice and the children had fallen asleep. He listened to the rain drumming against the roof, thought of the muddy fields outside, and wondered how many more nights his family would survive like this. By morning, the rain had lessened, but the damage had already been done. The soil was waterlogged, the seedlings drowned. Thomas walked out into the field, boots sinking into the mud with every step. The oxen stood nearby, shivering in the cold. They looked at him with tired eyes, waiting for commands they barely had the strength to follow. John joined him without a word, taking up the wooden plow and pushing forward with all his might. Together, father and son struggled to break through the thick earth, but the effort yielded nothing. The land refused to give. Alice remained inside, tending to Mary, who had grown so weak she could no longer sit upright. Her fever had not broken, and there were no herbs left to soothe her pain. Alice whispered prayers under her breath, hoping someone beyond the clouds was listening. Outside, Thomas watched the sky darken again. Another storm was coming. There was no escape from it, no shelter, just the slow, inevitable descent into hunger. As the wind picked up, he saw the other villagers emerging from their homes, faces lined with worry. Some carried baskets in search of roots or berries. Others simply stood in silence, staring at the fields that had once promised survival. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Thomas turned back to the plow, gripping the handle with both hands. He would not stop. Not yet. Even if the land gave nothing, he would keep trying. Because stopping meant surrender, meant watching his family fade away like the last light of dusk. And so he worked. Through the rain, through the cold, through the silence. Night had settled over Windlow like a thick, suffocating blanket. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the trees, sending shivers through the thatched roofs and wooden walls of the village. Inside his small cottage, Thomas lay awake, listening to the uneven breaths of his children and the quiet rustling of Alice as she tried to keep Mary warm beneath their thin woolen blankets. Sleep eluded him. His mind churned with worry, his body tense with the weight of unspoken fears. Outside, the world was silent, too silent. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were absent. It was as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for something unseen to emerge from the darkness. A knock echoed softly against the door. Thomas sat up slowly, heart pounding. He glanced at Alice, who remained still, pretending to be asleep. She had heard it too. Another knock followed, firmer this time, more insistent. Thomas wrapped his cloak around his shoulders and stepped cautiously into the cold night air. Brother Robert stood beneath the overhang, soaked and shivering. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Without a word, he motioned for Thomas to follow. There was urgency in his movements, a kind of silent desperation that Thomas could not ignore. They walked together toward the edge of the village, where the forest loomed like a wall of blackness. The monk's breath came in short, uneven bursts, mingling with the mist that curled along the ground. When they stopped beneath the twisted limbs of an old oak tree, Robert finally spoke. "The famine is coming," he whispered, voice barely audible above the wind. "But there are rumors spreading faster than hunger." Thomas frowned. "What kind of rumors?" Robert hesitated before answering. "That Lord Hugo has made a deal with someone from the north. A man no one knows. Some say he's a merchant. Others say he's something else entirely." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "And what do you believe?" "I don't know," Robert admitted. "But I've seen things. Villagers disappearing in the night. Families who owed nothing suddenly gone. And last week, a child vanished from the forest without a trace." A chill crawled up Thomas's spine. He had heard whispers, too, of strange figures moving through the trees, of voices in the dark that did not belong to men. "We must act," Robert continued, "before it's too late." Thomas clenched his jaw. He had spent his life working the land, obeying the Lord, enduring whatever hardship came his way. But this was different. This was not just hunger. This was fear. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt something stir inside him that he had long forgotten. Anger. He looked back toward his home, where his family slept unaware of the storm gathering beyond their walls. The thought of leaving them vulnerable gnawed at his conscience, but staying meant doing nothing while the village crumbled around them. Robert placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "There are others," he said quietly. "People who have seen what I've seen. People who are ready to fight back." Thomas exhaled slowly, nodding once. He would hear them out. He would learn the truth, even if it cost him everything. As they turned away from the cottage, the wind carried a sound unlike any other, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It slithered through the trees, curling around their legs like invisible tendrils of smoke. Thomas froze. The whisper grew louder. Then silence. Just as quickly as it had come, it vanished, leaving only the distant hoot of an owl and the steady rhythm of their footsteps against the damp earth. Neither man spoke again until they reached the outskirts of the village, where a flickering torchlight revealed the presence of others. 5 figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods and fear. One of them stepped forward, a woman with sharp eyes and a scar running down her cheek. She regarded Thomas with suspicion before speaking. "You're the farmer," she said, voice low and measured. Thomas nodded. She exchanged a glance with Brother Robert before turning back to him. "Then you need to see this." Without another word, she led them deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the moonlight barely touched the ground. They moved carefully, stepping over roots and fallen branches, the only sound being their cautious breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath their boots. Finally they stopped. Before them lay a clearing, eerily untouched by the chaos of the village. At its center stood a stone altar, worn and cracked with age. Around it, symbols had been carved into the bark of the surrounding trees, markings that none of them recognized. Thomas felt the hair on his arms rise. Something about this place was wrong. Very wrong. The woman crouched beside the altar and pointed to the ground. There, half buried in the soil, were remnants of cloth, tattered and stained with something dark. "A child's clothing," she muttered. "We found it yesterday. No sign of the boy. Just this." Thomas swallowed hard. Robert knelt beside her, fingers tracing the edge of the fabric. "This isn't just superstition," he murmured. "This is real." The woman stood, her expression grim. More will disappear unless we stop it. Thomas looked around at the gathered villagers, farmers, shepherds, even a blacksmith's apprentice. None of them were warriors. None of them were scholars or knights. But they were people who had lost too much already. And now they were afraid, not just of hunger, not just of the Lord, but of something far older, something lurking just beyond the reach of firelight. Thomas took a deep breath. "We'll find the truth," he said, "no matter what it takes." The wind howled through the trees as Thomas made his way back to the cottage, the weight of what he had seen pressing heavily on his shoulders. The clearing, the altar, the torn remnants of a child's clothing, they all pointed to something far darker than mere superstition. He could not ignore it, and he would not. Inside, Alice sat beside Mary, still awake despite the late hour. She looked up as Thomas entered, her eyes searching his face for answers. He said nothing at first, only removed his damp cloak and sat down across from her. "We have to do something," he finally murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Alice exhaled slowly, nodding. She had seen the change in him. The fire that had long been buried beneath years of quiet suffering was now beginning to burn again. Thomas glanced toward John, who lay asleep on a straw mat near the hearth. His son had already taken more than his share of burdens for a boy his age. But this was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting what little remained. He stood and moved to the wooden chest at the foot of their bed, lifting the lid carefully. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a rusted dagger, a relic from his father's time. He had never needed it before. Now he might. Alice watched him without protest. By dawn, Thomas was gone. He moved quickly through the village, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of Lord Hugo's men. The roads were still slick with overnight rain, the fields beyond them drowning in mud. Yet, he pressed forward, guided by instinct and the memory of Brother Robert's words. There was a path, one hidden deep within the forest, rarely used, and spoken of only in hushed tones. Some claimed it led to an abandoned monastery. Others said it was cursed, a place where those who walked it never returned. Thomas did not care. He needed answers, and he would find them. As he reached the tree line, the air grew colder. The forest swallowed him whole, its towering oaks and thick underbrush blotting out the morning light. Birds had fallen silent. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Then ahead he saw it, a break in the trees, barely visible beneath the overgrowth. A narrow trail wound into the depths of the woods, disappearing into shadow. He stepped forward. The deeper he went, the more the world behind him faded. No longer was he just a farmer struggling against the elements. He was something else now, a man driven by purpose. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting pale beams through the canopy. The path twisted and turned, leading him past ruins half buried in moss and stone markers worn smooth by time. This place had once been used, perhaps even revered. At last, he came upon a clearing unlike any other. Before him stood the remnants of an old chapel, its roof long since collapsed, its walls cracked and crumbling. Vines crept along the stone, and ivy had overtaken the altar at its center. But it was not the structure that drew his attention. It was the figure standing before it. A man, cloaked and hooded, knelt beside the altar, whispering words Thomas could not understand. At his feet lay a bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. Thomas tightened his grip on the dagger. He had found the truth, and it was more terrifying than he had imagined. The man did not react at first, continuing his chant in a low, guttural tone. The wind carried the scent of burnt herbs and something else, something unnatural. Thomas took a cautious step forward, heart hammering in his chest. The man's voice rose. Then, abruptly, he stopped. Slowly, he turned his head, revealing only the edge of a gaunt face beneath the hood. His eyes met Thomas's, dark, empty, and filled with something that sent a chill through his very core. Thomas swallowed hard. The bundle at the man's feet stirred. His breath caught. Something inside the cloth shifted. A hand. No, a child's hand. Fingers twitched, lifeless but moving. Thomas stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing on the damp earth. His mind screamed at him to run, to turn away and forget what he had seen. But his legs refused to obey. The man stood. With deliberate slowness, he reached into his cloak and pulled free a small vial filled with thick, black liquid. He held it up, letting the sunlight catch its surface. Thomas recognized the symbol carved into the glass. It matched the markings on the trees surrounding the village. The man tilted his head, as if studying Thomas. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the trees, leaving the bundle behind. Thomas stood frozen. The wind howled. The cloth around the child's body began to unravel. And then, silence. Not the kind of silence that came after sound, but the kind that swallowed everything whole, the kind that warned of things better left undiscovered. Thomas forced himself to move. He approached cautiously, kneeling beside the bundle. His hands trembled as he reached out, fingers brushing against the fabric. The child's eyes were open, staring, empty. Thomas closed his own eyes. He had seen death before. He had buried neighbors, friends, even family. But this was different. This was wrong. He rose slowly, heart pounding like a war drum. He could not leave the child here, exposed to the elements and whatever forces had brought him to this place. Carefully, he lifted the body, cradling it in his arms. The weight felt heavier than it should have. As he turned back toward the path, he glanced once more at the ruined chapel. Something told him this was only the beginning, that what he had seen here was merely the surface of something far worse, and that he was already too deep to turn back. The cold arrived like an uninvited guest, unwelcome, persistent, and impossible to ignore. One moment, the world still clung to the last remnants of autumn, brittle leaves clinging to branches, the faint scent of smoke in the air, the distant sound of wind rustling through dry grass. The next, it was gone, replaced by snow, ice, and a silence so thick it felt like suffocation. Thomas stood at the edge of his field, watching as the wind carried soft flakes across the frozen earth. There would be no harvest this year. Not now. Not ever. The soil had betrayed them, soaked and ruined by endless rains. And the Lord had taken what little remained. Inside the cottage, Alice moved with quiet determination, rationing what scraps they had left. A handful of dried roots, a few stale crusts of bread. It was not enough. Nothing would be enough. John sat near the hearth, staring into the dying embers. His body had grown thin, his face gaunt. He had stopped asking when they would eat again. He knew the answer. Mary lay beneath layers of woolen blankets, her breathing shallow. She did not cry anymore. That frightened Thomas more than anything else. Night fell quickly, swallowing the village whole. The wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls, carrying with it the promise of something worse than hunger, something deeper than fear. Brother Robert arrived just before midnight, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his breath visible in the cold air. "They've started taking everything," he whispered. "Even the seeds for next spring." Thomas clenched his fists. "What?" "Lord Hugo says it's the only way to survive the winter." Thomas knew better. This wasn't survival. It was theft. Slow, methodical, and cruel. He looked at his family, at the empty sacks, at the fire that barely burned. "We can't wait any longer," he said. Robert nodded. "There are others who feel the same. We're meeting tonight." Thomas hesitated only once. Then he pulled on his cloak and stepped into the night. Outside, the village was nearly silent. No laughter, no music, no voices at all. Just the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional groan of wind against the trees. They reached the clearing beyond the forest, where a small group had already gathered. Faces were drawn, eyes hollow. Some held torches. Others carried tools turned into weapons. A woman with a scar down her cheek stepped forward. "They took my son yesterday," she said, voice steady but filled with pain. No warning, no reason. Another man spoke. "They took my grain, my cow, my hope." Thomas looked around at the faces of those who had suffered as he had. These were not warriors, not scholars, not knights, but they were people who had nothing left to lose. "We take back what is ours," he said. No one argued. By morning, the plan was set. They would strike at dawn. They would reclaim what had been stolen. And if Lord Hugo refused to listen, then he would learn what desperation could make men do. The night was darker than usual, and the wind carried a bitter chill that cut through even the thickest wool. Snow had begun to fall again, covering the village of Windlow in a thin layer of white. Not enough to soften the edges of suffering, but just enough to make every step harder. Thomas stood at the edge of the forest, breath visible in the cold air. Behind him, a small group of villagers waited in silence. They had come armed with whatever they could find: rusted knives, wooden clubs, pitchforks meant for farming, but now repurposed for war. Their faces were hollow, their bodies weak from hunger, but their eyes burned with something deeper than fear: determination. They had no plan beyond reaching Lord Hugo's manor and demanding what was theirs: the grain, the seeds, the right to survive. And if he refused, then they would take it by force. Brother Robert stepped beside Thomas, his voice barely above a whisper. "This won't end peacefully." Thomas nodded. He had known that from the moment he made the decision. There was no turning back now. They moved as one, stepping carefully through the snow-covered paths, avoiding torchlight where they could. The village was eerily quiet, too quiet. Even the dogs had gone silent, sensing the tension in the air. At the manor gates, 2 guards stood watch. They didn't see them coming. John moved first, striking one from behind before he could cry out. The second turned, raising his sword, but Thomas was faster. He drove the rusted dagger into the man's side, feeling the warmth of blood spill between his fingers. They dragged the bodies into the shadows and pushed forward. Inside, the manor was warm, the fire crackling in the great hall. Servants moved quietly, unaware of what was happening outside. At the far end of the room sat Lord Hugo himself, drinking wine and laughing with his closest men. Thomas stepped forward, the dagger still slick with blood. "My family is starving," he said, voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Lord Hugo looked up slowly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "And you've come to steal from me?" "We've come to take what is ours." The laughter died. A long silence followed. Then, Lord Hugo stood. "You think you can challenge me? A peasant with a knife and dreams of rebellion." Thomas took another step forward. "I don't dream. I act." The guards moved. Steel clashed. Cries echoed through the halls. The battle was short but brutal. By the time it ended, the floor was stained red. Some villagers had fallen. So had some of the Lord's men. But in the end, only one man remained standing at the center of it all: Thomas. He walked toward Lord Hugo, who knelt on the floor, clutching a wound in his side. "This isn't over," the Lord spat. Thomas raised the dagger. "It is for you." He brought it down. Once, twice, and then silence. The manor fell still. Thomas turned to the others. "Take what we need. We leave before dawn." They did. By morning, the villagers had what little food remained. Seeds are distributed among those who could still plant. And though the winter had not yet passed, hope had returned. Not because the land had changed, but because the people had.